Hi, welcome to Podcast for Social Work. I'm Michael, and this podcast is intended to help social work students who are preparing for their graduate or license exams as a beginner's guide in exploring social work concepts, theories, and treatment. Additional resources are mentioned at the end of the podcast. Hope it helps in some way. So, the topic for the day is existential therapy. And a special note. Um, this is going to be a bit difficult, so just hold on and it should be okay. So, existential therapy is a philosophical method of therapy that operates on the belief that inner conflict within a person is due to that individual's confrontation with the established facts of the existence, that is, the already known facts of the existence. So when a person is not able to accept the meaning of life as he faces, or the meaning of suffering, or about death, and all the phenomenological aspects one comes across in life, then that's when the existential psychotherapy is used to attend to. So when you are going to ask me what is existential therapy, I will tell you that's the most difficult question to answer, because the term existential therapy has been used to refer to so many different therapeutic practices. It doesn't have just one particular strata which you can actually follow, because there are several therapists who followed the existential philosophy and developed several different types of existential therapy. So, because Yalom's existential psychotherapy encourages clients to face up to four ultimate concerns of existence, like death, freedom, isolation, meaninglessness. Whereas Vaughan's existential psychotherapy encourages clients to explore four dimensions of worldly being, that is, your physical reality, your personal aspect, your social and spiritual dimension. Similarly, Bergentel's existential humanistic approach encourages clients to focus in on their subjective experiences, whereas Frankel's existential analysis frequently encourages clients to focus out on their responsibilities towards others. So, as several other commentators have concluded, then it is simply not possible to define the field of existential therapy in any particular way. Rather, it is best understood as an integrative pattern of therapeutic practices, all of which orient themselves around a shared concern, which is nothing else other than human lived existence. So each existential therapy has a specific existential philosophical stance, which makes it very difficult to understand. The key existential philosophers, when you try to look back to what they propose, the philosopher Søren, who was a Danish philosopher and the father of modern existentialism, he criticized the lack of passion and the conformity of the 19th century Christendom. That is, it has a very, very small thread of line between religion, philosophy, and the theoretical aspects. So he was embracing Christianity, and he argued that human beings needed to turn towards their own subjective truths and make a personal leap. Whereas Nietzsche, a German philosopher, attacked the slavish herd mentality of conventional Christianity and preached an atheistic gospel of aspiration towards self, the autonomous Superman who creates his or her own values and morality and lives an earthly life of passion and power. So his starting point was the notion that God is dead, that that is, the idea of God is outmoded and limiting, and that it is up to us to reevaluate existence in light of this. So he invited people to realize moral and societal constraint and to discover their free will in order to live according to their own desires. So now the only maintainable law in his philosophy is self. So he encouraged people to transcend the mores of civilization and choose their own strands. So this is the first time where the important existential themes of freedom, choice, responsibility, and courage are introduced through Nietzsche. And Buber Martin is a Jewish philosopher and theologian. He emphasized the relational nature of human existence and the distinction between I, thou, and I, it modes of relating. And Karl Jaspers, he's a German psychiatrist who turned to be a philosopher and whose ideas underpinned many 20th century developments in existential philosophy. And among them are the unavoidable boundary situations that human beings face. And Paul, a German Protestant theologian who fled to the United States in the 1930s, brought up with him the existential style of philosophizing. That is, he advocated courage in the face of an anxiety of non-being and distinguished between existential and neurotic anxiety and guilt. And Marcel Gabriel is a French philosopher and a Christian too. He emphasized the mysteriousness and immeasurability of existence and the importance of fidelity and openness to others, as well as the primacy of hope. And Martin, a German philosopher, who is one of the influential existential thinkers, emphasized resolution in the face of anxiety, guilt, and death, whilst later work placed greater emphasis on language and an openness toward being. And Sartre Paul, Jean Paul, who was a French philosopher and a novelist, is also a best known existential philosopher who emphasized that freedom at the heart of human existence and meaninglessness and nausea that it evokes. Later, his work shifted towards a more Marxist style. So what you could actually observe from the list of these philosophers and their background is that there is a group who are deeply religious and another group who is committed atheists, and both are trying to find out the existence of human lives, the meaning, or what is important, or how should be who human lives be spent, and so on and so. Since there are different kinds of existential therapies, I would just focus on one short-term existential humanistic therapy and provide you with resources at the end of the podcast. So, in Snyder and May's book of The Psychology of Existence, James very briefly sketches out some preliminary thoughts on short-term existential humanistic approach. So this structure consists of a series of sequential phases, each of which may occupy a session or more, although the exact pace will depend on each client-therapist pairing. And the phases are as follows. The first is assessment. So the therapist and the client assess whether the presenting problem can be isolated from its context and whether the client is able to engage in an intensive therapeutic process. And moving on to phase two, where they identify the concern. The client is encouraged to present his concern in the most succinct form and a specific focused object is established. And phase three consists in teaching the searching process. The client is encouraged to examine her subjective experiences of concern under examination. And four, identifying resistances. So the client here is helped to identify and realize the significance of resistance to an awareness of this concern. In contrast to long-term therapy, however, the client is not invited to work through the resistances, but to just simply take note of them and return to the inner search once again. And phase 5 consists of the therapeutic work. So here the client and the therapist address the issue of central concern, keeping a clear focus on the issue and not allowing it to be distracted or displaced by other issues. And phase 6 is the last phase, and it is the termination phase. The client is encouraged to assess what has been accomplished and what remains to be done, and the extent to which she has incorporated the searching process into her extra therapeutic life. So the client and therapist may negotiate a new series of short-term therapeutic sessions. So since existential therapy could be of different kinds, Um, I will just outline the shared therapeutic practices. Um, One is the aim of the therapeutic work is to help clients become more aware or become that is to become more aware of their actual existence and to live more in accordance with their true values, beliefs, and experiences. And the therapists tend to work with the concrete actuality of clients' experiences rather than viewing these experiences in terms of abstract or hypothetical constructs. And clients are encouraged to acknowledge and act on their freedom and responsibility. Clients are encouraged to acknowledge, accept, and learn from the more negative feelings such as anxiety, guilt, despair, and a sense of tragedy. The clients are encouraged to explore their present and future experiences as well as their past ones sometimes. The clients are encouraged to explore all aspects of their being, their emotions, beliefs, behaviors, physiological responses, and so on, and to see these aspects as fundamentally interconnected. The therapists tend to be relatively genuine and direct with their clients rather than adopting the role of a blank screen. Flexibility and adaptability of practice tend to be emphasized over fixed and immovable boundaries. So these are the shared therapeutic practices, and the differences between the existential therapeutic practice is also very clear because some of them are phenomenological and some of them are existential, whereas certain existential therapy is directive and certain others are non-directive. And another dimension in which existential therapies vary is the extent to which the therapeutic process is seen as an exploration of psychological experiences or as a philosophical exploration of how to live life in a constructive and meaningful way. And in the dimension of immediacy and non-immediacy, where certain existential therapies tends to focus the therapeutic work around the immediate therapeutic relationship as opposed to paying less attention to the therapist's client dynamics, um, whereas certain others put greater emphasis on the immediate therapeutic encounter and advocate a more self-disclosing therapeutic stance. Also, the existential therapies differ in terms of spontaneity and techniques, um, like how the therapist handles the client in terms of handling their issues or putting forth in a spontaneous or unpermeated way. Again, however, in contrast to other therapeutic approaches, especially when you look onto cognitive behavioral therapy, all of the existential therapies, apart from logotherapy, tend to be at a relatively spontaneous end of the spontaneity technique dimension. So each existential approaches to therapy tend to sit on each of the dimensions as we discussed. Um, Certain fell on the phenomenological side and certain were existential. Like logotherapy, it's both existential and directive, whereas certain other therapies are very psychological and non-directive, and certain other are subjective and the others are inwardly. So coming to the challenges faced by existential therapy is that the questions that existential philosophers address are the questions that human beings have always asked themselves, but for which they have never found a satisfactory answer. And sometimes this provokes an anxiety in them. Say, for example, you are confronting a question about your being, like what is the meaning of your being? Well, why do you have to live this life? Or what does it mean to die? And or when you have to face a death of a loved one, or how can you live a worthwhile life, or how should you act and relate to people, or why there is something rather than nothing. And these questions, which are very familiar, can also be problematic sometimes. So this makes existential therapy difficult to work with. Also, In spite of the familiarity, there are some good reasons why these ideas are not well known in psychotherapy. First, existential therapy does not have a single founding author with which it can be identified. No Pavlov, no Pearls or Rogers, so this somewhat makes it go in a multi-directed way. And second is, it has its roots in philosophy, which can be quite difficult for people to use, which, in spite of its intimate connections to the questions of living and its long history, has always been rather an academic discipline. So all therapeutic perspectives have a philosophical basis, but this is rarely acknowledged. So when you go to an existential therapist, the discussion is more of a behavioral and psychological aspect rather than concrete philosophical manner, exploring the questions of being and facing the anxiety of human beings, meaning to life, and so on. Because the therapists or counselors themselves are not used to exploring these questions in a philosophical manner, that makes it very difficult for them to help another client who is also having the same difficulty in trying to explore his being. So that is another important challenge in using existential psychotherapy. So I have not covered much of the existential therapies to make the presentation short, but I will give you a useful tool for further. The primary resource is Existential Therapies by Mick Cooper. This is available in the public domain, and it's one of the Sage publications. And the other material would be The Framework of Existential Therapy, and this is also available in the public domain. And these two would better serve your purpose for understanding existential therapy than your Google search or Wikipedia. Hope it helped in some way. And for more information, you can always log on to um, the blog, the Social Worker in US blog, where you always have additional information on the therapies discussed. Thank you.